All right, the last thing we have to cover in the Gilded Age, there actually existed an early civil rights movement. And this is not Dr. King, but this is before everything there. And so I want to get into this with you for a little bit. Now, when we last left civil rights, we left it with Civil War Amendments 13, 14, 15. Things do not look good in the South. We have 40 acres and a mule, and some people decide to tackle this thing head on. So the first thing we need to talk about, I told you the most controversial amendment of those three was the 14th Amendment. Reason is it used the word equal protection, and so they said, well, if we can provide separate, we can also provide equal, and so they used that. Another big case here where they actually upheld that was called the slaughterhouse cases, and so it actually dealt with a couple of slaughterhouses and how they were grouping the people who work there in different areas, and so they basically said, hey, they have a roof over their head, they're fine, so we can't do anything. Now, and so that's slaughterhouse cases. It will uphold separate but equal and kind of make the idea of the 14th Amendment a little bit unclear. Now, the next biggest thing, you have the Solid South peace offering. The Republican Party is dead in the South, right? And so the color line is broken here. Now, if you notice here, the Democratic ticket, etc., and we have Jim Crow. And so what existed in the South was something called disenfranchisement. Disenfranchisement we've had before basically means you discourage someone from doing something. In this case, we're going to discourage black males from voting. And they did that through three methods. All right? The first one is this. This is a poll tax receipt for 1964, which is ironic because it was one of the last years they're going to be allowed to do it. If you notice here, they had age, they had state, county, occupation, and if you notice here, we actually have white, colored, and we have male and female. So that's pretty interesting. The whole idea of a poll tax is if you couldn't pay, you couldn't vote. Now, the next thing we're going to spend a little bit of time here in a second is actually called a literacy test. If you couldn't read, you couldn't write. Now, the problem is, look at this. This literacy test, anyone who could not prove a fifth grade education. Now, let's see here. Where's a really, really good one? There you go. In the space below, draw three circles, one inside or engulfed by the other. That's a good one, right? Draw a line through the two letters that come last in the alphabet. In the first circle below, write the letter of the first word beginning with L. In the first circle below, write the last letter of the first word beginning with L. Figure that one out for a second. Cross out the number necessary when making the number below 1 million. And so this is more or less not a literacy test, but other stuff, and so we're going to look at this. But the general idea was if you couldn't read, you couldn't vote. If you could somehow pass those two, they went to this one. It's the Grandfather Clause. The Grandfather Clause basically said that freed black men had the same social status as their grandfather. If your grandfather couldn't vote, then you can't vote. Problem is, everyone's grandfather was a slave, and so this eliminated tons of people and kept the Solid South going. Okay? So those were the methods. Now, there existed two types of segregation, and we're going to look at these here right now. And that is de facto and de jure. And so I have these two things here. I actually went second. So, de jure segregation is by law. The way I remember that, it kind of sounds like jury, doesn't it? So jury, remember judicial branch is law, etc. This is licensed by law. The example here, Jim Crow in the South and the slave codes. So we have here white water fountain, colored water fountain. You can tell this one is refrigerated and cold, whereas this one is not, even though they both come out of the same water, correct? The second type of segregation is called de facto. It means in practice. This is segregation that becomes embedded in social customs and institutions. And they said here the segregation of Milwaukee nightlife. And so you have here, we want white tenants in our community. That is de facto. This is the same thing you would find de facto segregation in school cafeterias. You would find it in buses. You will find it in churches. You will find it in hair salons. All these places today practice de facto segregation. And there's no sign saying, you have to do this because that'd be wrong. People are just drawn to this because it has been embedded in our customs and institution. It is in practice, all right? And so there is that. Now, the things I want you to do here are two things. I want you to explain the methods and effectiveness of disenfranchisement. There were three. And then secondly, I want you to compare de jure with de facto segregation. If you have to come back to the slide, that is absolutely fine.